Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to the poem Osceola. This is poem 21 of the 31 of Goodbye My Fancy. Now, we're back to Whitman's fascination with Native American culture, and we've talked about the fact that it's complicated with Whitman, no question. In some poems he seems to celebrate, in other poems he seems to denigrate. We've already commented a number of times on this. But we got to be honest, this is one of the hardest poems in Leaves of Grass to read. However, I think intentionally so, Whitman is wishing to identify with this famous Seminole leader that will die tragically. So much of background will be crucial in our study here. Now, our assumptions are that you followed our stuff at learnstrong.net down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, and that you've been with us from the very beginning, those early poems as we reference them from inscriptions and elsewhere. We did give a set of introductory comments to Goodbye My Fancy that I'm hopeful that you are familiar with as well. Now, our Nortons will give us some important information. Of course, Whitman himself will have some background information right under the title Osceola. He says it this way: when I was nearly grown to manhood, he was almost 18, in Brooklyn, New York, middle of 1838. I met one of the returned U.S. Marines from Fort Moultrie, South Carolina, and had long talks with him. Learned the occurrence below described, death of Osceola. The latter was a young, brave, leading Seminole in the Florida War of that time, was surrendered to our troops, imprisoned, and literally died of a quote-unquote broken heart at Fort Moultrie. He sickened out of his confinement. The doctor and officers made every allowance and kindness possible for him. Then the close, and then there's a colon, and then the parenthetic, and then the poem itself will begin. Now, Norton's will tell us that this was first published in Munson's Illustrated World, April of 1890, and that the inspiration of the poem derives in part from a large print of Osceola given to Walt Whitman by the artist George Catlin. And just to continue, so that you have a bit more background knowledge here, Sierra Oliver will tell us this, that the origins of the death of Osceola, whose name means rising sun, so you want to write that down, still remain obscure. Legend has it he was the son of an English trader and an Indian Creek woman. Born around 1800, he opposed the forced relocation of his tribe and fought against Andrew Jackson in 1812-1818. Then fled to Florida and joined the Seminoles. In 1834, he refused to sign a treaty to relocate west, and angry at the threats of General Thompson, stuck a knife through the document, defacing it. Soon, some white raiders kidnapped Osceola's wife. He went to Fort King to demand justice, but instead was put in prison for 20 months. Set free, he returned on 28 December 1835 and killed the general and his secretary. When, on October of 1837, he appeared under a flag of truce at the Three Pines, he was seized and taken prisoner to St. Augustine and later transferred to Fort Moultrie, where on 10 January 1838 he died. Whitman's early journalistic training and 6 months' work at the Indian Bureau in Washington, D.C. in 1865 helped him to understand the plight of the American Indians and later to see the need to add to Leaves of Grass his homage to Osceola, one of his bravest heroes. I think there's something else going on here too. I think Whitman himself knows there are different stories of how heroes die. Osceola will be one. Obviously, we think about Plato's Phaedo and Socrates drinking his hemlock shake. I think that Whitman himself was interested in his own passing, and so as he plays this game, and much of this, obviously, all of this imagined, because it's not like Whitman actually was there when Osceola died. However, I think it's fascinating, and I think we got some biblical tonal allusions going on here as well that we'll play around with. Again, just to remind, Osceola, name itself, Rising Sun. I think that's important to the reading of this poem. When his hour for death had come, he slowly raised himself from the bed on the floor, drew on his war dress, shirt, leggings, and girdled the belt around his waist, called for vermilion paint. His looking glass was held before him, painted half his face and neck, his wrists and back hands, put the scalp knife carefully in his belt, then lying down, resting a moment, rose again, half sitting, smiled, gave in silence his extended hand to each and all, sank faintly low to the floor, tightly grasping the tomahawk handle, fixed his look on wife and little children, the last. And here, a line in memory of his name and death. Now, again, this is fascinating to study, and Norton's will tell us that the date of Osceola's death, January 30th, 1838, verifies Whitman's date. And again, Norton's will tell us, a gallant young leader of the Second Seminole War, 1835-37, he was treacherously seized and imprisoned while conferring under an American truce agreement. Although not otherwise abused, he died within 4 months, substantiating the widespread belief that his race could not survive either in slavery or in captivity. Notice the language, the opening line. When his hour for death had come, takes us back to the biblical referencing of Christ in Matthew 27:46. Go back and take a look at that. Notice all the adverbs. He slowly raised himself, again the name Rising Sun, Osceola, from the bed on the floor. Notice it's on the floor. In other words, to his last day, he remains consistent to his own understanding of respect, sleeping next to the ground on the floor. He drew on, notice now, it's almost like a form of cataloging. He drew on his war dress, we're going to get to the tomahawk, obviously, and the knife in a bit, shirt, leggings, and girdled the belt around his waist. So, in other words, he dresses for battle. He calls for vermilion. This, by the way, the only use in Leaves of Grass of vermilion, obviously red paint. And then in parenthetics, his looking glass was held before him. He painted, notice, half his face and neck, his wrists, back hands, and then put the, notice it's not knife, it's the scout knife, carefully, again these words are significant, in his belt, the dash, then lying down, resting a moment, rose again we're back to Rising Sun, half sitting, and then the key word smiled, and then gave in silence his extended hand to each and all. In other words, he's ready to leave. In other words, he will go on his own terms. I think there's a whole lot going on here for Whitman himself. And then we're back to sank, faintly low to the floor, and then in parenthetics, tightly grasping the tomahawk handle. And again, this idea of he's a fighter to the very end. Fixed his look on wife and little children, so the last thing that he looks at. And is there some romanticizing going on here? Of course there is, no doubt. Whitman is certainly romanticizing, and yet I think there's more going on here than just Osceola for Whitman. I think he's trying to figure out how best is it for one to take one's last breath, right? So he's maybe imagining it for himself. And then he'll say it, fixed his look on his wife and little children, the last, you'll remember in Song of Myself 37, the last gasp. You can go back and look at how he uses it there. And then in parenthetics, and here, a line in memory of his name and death. Well, what's going on here? Well, clearly, he wants to argue at 2a that great warriors deserve to be remembered, and I think he's hopeful that he himself will be remembered. At 2b, notice the power of Osceola meaning the rising sun, as we are now watching a man lying on the floor and then rising from the floor to bid goodbye to those he cares most for. At 3a, well, go back to By Blue Ontario Shore number 17, passage 17. I am, he said, for those that have never been mastered. And clearly, this is his celebration, not only of Osceola, but of the great Seminole people. We think, of course, at 3A of D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, the 1970 offering, and then, of course, all of the Leaves of Grass poems that have to do with celebrating and at times critiquing Native peoples. Finally, at 3B, how are you going to own a poem like this? Well, if you could choose your way to go, to leave, what would that be? And do you think this is maybe Whitman's ideal way, grasping the tomahawk by the handle, that is to say, preparing to leave as a fighter, as a scrapper? It's a fascinating little poem. I hope it's challenged you. Thank you.